to live stream pretty much on a daily basis or at least 5 days a week. And that's going to be basically this idea that light is central to our existence and developing a relationship and understanding deeper insight into it intimately can affect every aspect of our lives. Now, in the last couple of weeks, I've shared some thoughts in the live streams I've done on its scientific and technological implications at a high level. And of course, as indicated, I'm going to go a lot deeper into those in subsequent live streams. But today I wanted to offer something different. And this is more on the practical aspects of the application of light. And in particular, there's a series of articles that I wrote for Forbes on light. And I summarized those in my blog post on cosmology of light. And today, I'm going to go into at least the first article and just speak about the genesis, speak about the emphasis of the article, and also suggest how it's been applied practically. So, stepping back, over the course of the last couple of years, I wrote quite a bit for Forbes, and essentially I focused on the area of complex adaptive systems, which is something that I've been incredibly interested in, primarily because it's so practical, but it's multidisciplinary. So complex adaptive systems as a field kind of brings together a lot of different disciplines. And the reason I find it exciting, both academically and practically, academically, of course, because the materials that arise in the area of complex adaptive systems are new. There's, I think, a lot of very good thought that goes into thinking about complex adaptive systems. And essentially, it's also very practical in the sense that when we think about any kind of organizational problem that we might be experiencing, and here I use the word organization very largely to apply at different levels of granularity. So it could be a small organization, it could be a market, it could be an economy, it could be an entire ecosystem, it could be just looking at the a problem of climate change, for instance. So all these are categories of or applications of the field of complex adaptive systems. And there's a few key tenets or principles that would be common across any kind of complex adaptive system. So, how does this relate to light? I've suggested before that, when we, in a cosmology of light, when we think about light, light to me is a foundation, a very integral foundation from which everything arises. And a complex adaptive system is a particular instance of a set of mechanisms that all arise from light, but yet they're evolutionary, they're very resilient. So studying them gives us deeper insight into the dynamics and mechanics of light, and therefore it's very interesting to look at it from that point of view. Now, in these Forbes articles, as I mentioned, I had written perhaps a series, I would say about 12 or 13, maybe 14 articles on complex adaptive systems. And I wanted to write about light because the arena that we are faced with globally has a lot of change, and there's a concept in complex adaptive systems called far from equilibrium. And our intuition, or when we think about a particular circumstance or a particular problem, we always want things to be in equilibrium. We want to know how to address things, what the dynamics are, what the forces in play are, how do you understand those? And so we have instinctively this sense of trying to make a system reach a stage of equilibrium. Now, by contrast, in complex adaptive systems, the notion of being far from equilibrium is really important because it suggests to us that we're in a living system, we're in a system where the boundaries are never the same from day to day. So the world today is different from the world yesterday. But the fact is that, whether we have learned frameworks, and if we went to business school or even in the organizations that we work, these always lag. By definition, they lag. A framework always lags from the reality that we face outside. And to me, light being something that's fundamental, that connects everything, from which everything arises, seemed to be an instrument which we could leverage to try and frame and try and think about differently this area of complex adaptive systems. So I began some experiments. I used to work I worked with Zappos for about 5 years, and I was the head of organizational sciences for Zappos. The last a couple of years, I am no longer with Zappos since October this year, and I'm now focusing entirely on the cosmology of light. But while I was with Zappos, I conducted lots of workshops internally for a period of about, I would say, a year and a half. So I would have roughly around two light workshops, cosmology of light workshops, a month. So I would say in all, perhaps about 15, I had about 15 to 20 light workshops, maybe a little bit more. And then I also began an experiment to offer these cosmology of light workshops externally as part of a service offered by Zappos. And I held a lot of workshops externally. I would say probably around 50 workshops that involved lots of different people from different arenas of life, and different, not just in corporations, but artists, writers, technicians, programmers, just people who were freelancing, just health professionals. So from many different avenues, there were hundreds of people who went through these workshops, and I wanted to summarize succinctly some key takeaways from these workshops. And so I approached Forbes to write an article on essentially the use of cosmology of light, or the use of light as an instrument to help manage the complex environment that we are increasingly faced with, and the increasing complexity of the world, that just by any kind of traditional framework, we simply are inadequate to understand what's going on. But since light connects everything, if we can connect with light, my proposal was that it would offer us a different kind of connection to everything that's going on, and perhaps even a different way to begin to solve problems. And so when I proposed this to Forbes, I never thought that they would agree to it, given the nature of just light in general. But to my surprise, they came back to me and said, "Can you write a couple of articles on light?" Because they thought that their readership would be pretty interested in it. And so that's the genesis of these articles on light. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into the first article, which was called "A Radical Driver of Change for Radical Times." And this article appeared in March of this year. So just about the same time as lockdown had started around the world, and also the way that people were used to operating had just completely changed. And this is all part of, if you will, the dynamics of being far from equilibrium, because we can say that, certainly for decades, we've had a certain expectation of how the world works. And perhaps it's been disrupted to a much higher degree than many of us can remember in our lifetimes. And this disruption has all started or escalated this year. So the system has gone very far from equilibrium. Now, when we think about a system being far from equilibrium, it's easy to get alarmed and to think we want to get it back in equilibrium. But the point in complex adaptive systems is that you've kind of you go with the flow, or any kind of system that is resilient, that can evolve, that can keep with the times, that can assimilate what's going on and change the way that it's operating based on what's happening externally, is a complex adaptive system. And so a complex adaptive system, by definition, thrives on being far from equilibrium. And the world that we've experienced certainly has been far from equilibrium. And some of course of the trends is we can see there's while there was a trend of increasing globalization, it's now become in a sense schizophrenic, because there's areas that want globalization and other areas that are clamping down on nationalism. So there's a bunch of opposing forces that have become real. There's easy switching of political ideologies across many parts of the world. There's, even if here in the United States, I live in San Francisco, and of course we've witnessed in the last few years very contrary pulls in different directions that all point to the reality of one system, but the way that we perceive things, or that we've learned to perceive things, we either we have a bias for one trend as opposed to another, and we put our energy behind one pull of the system as opposed to another. But the whole point is that that's not going to solve the issue, because these opposing trends are part of one system, and the system itself is challenging us to begin to integrate them in a new way. And for me, an application of light, so rethinking the system in terms of light, is a very practical approach to begin to get our heads around and even our hearts into how do we really address or try and understand what's going on with the system. Is there a way to connect with the system at a much deeper level, so that in a sense we're not observers of the system, we become one with the system? This may sound metaphysical or mystical, but I believe it's a very, very practical thing that we all have to embrace, and we have to master progressively, much more quickly in the next couple of years, I would even say. So really what I wanted to do in these articles, and as I said, I'm just going to focus on the first one, is expose the reader to this different paradigm of light. And if we think about light just practically, it's ubiquitous. We know, for instance, that every single object, living object or inanimate object, is created from a set of atoms. We know that every single atom has been forged in the light of the suns or the math of supernova. So by definition, everything around us, everything that we are, deeply has a signature of light inside it. So light is one of the easiest things to access. It's made, in a sense, all these atoms. There's a deep energetic imprint of light in everything that exists. But even if we think about a small little speck of space around us, it's packed with millions of photons, and we know that these photons are carriers of light and information. And all this information streams into our eyes, into our brains, and recreates for us everything that is going on in the world that we are able to perceive at any point in space or time. And so, in a sense, light grounds us in a massive light-based operating system. And of course, we also know that if we trace back the nutritional cycle of any living being, it comes down to a simple process called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis, of course, is dependent on the light of the sun. So even we require that light to sustain ourselves, even physically. So it's fair to say that without light, we wouldn't exist. And even if we think about the current nature of our world, Many of our infrastructures are derived from different wavelengths of the electromagnetic field. And the electromagnetic field is another way of specifying light. It's nothing other than light. And so whether it's infrared or ultraviolet or radio waves or microwaves or X-rays or gamma rays or visible light, these are all parts of one spectrum of light. And the point being that many of our technologies have arisen from the application of light, and therefore without that, even our current world wouldn't be what it is. And even when we extrapolate into the future is supposedly going to be driven a lot by optics and quanta, which are both derivative from light. So light holds a fundamental place for us, not only in everything that's arisen and in what we are now, not only in the way that our world is structured and operates, but also looking forward, it's expected that a lot of what the world will become is going to be driven by advances in the science and technology of light. So, when we develop this kind of understanding, or when we begin to perceive that light is everywhere, that we have deep access to it, the question is, can we develop a different relationship with light so that it can, in a sense, help us to address and solve practical problems? And so in this first article, what I wanted to do, as I said, was summarize some key points. And actually, the genesis of these key points also goes back to an interesting conversation that I had. I'm going to mention Tony Hsieh, who was the CEO of Zappos up until a couple of months ago. And I had the good fortune to work quite closely with him. And we had a conversation about a year ago in which I was sharing some of the work I was doing on light. And he challenged me to actually come up with 6 maxims on using light practically. And that's one of the key drivers of the genesis of these articles, where actually I introduced 6 maxims. And here in this first article, we'll go over the first 3 maxims. And, as I said, so I've conducted perhaps around 50, 60, I don't know, 70 light workshops in the last year and a half. And one of the things that I always tell all the participants is, let's approach this very scientifically, meaning that take 2 circumstances, 2 situations that are similar. It could be an interpersonal relationship, it could be a project you're working on. So just take 2 things that are similar, and on one of these situations, apply this technology of light that is going to be suggested in these articles, and on the other situation, don't, and begin to see for yourself how these situations might evolve differently. And so then kind of perceive the data, see as they evolve differently, what changes do you perceive in yourself? What changes do you perceive in other actors in the situation, in the actual outcome of the project itself? And then take that data and make a determination for yourself whether, in fact, just the mere act of visualizing light in a particular way can have practical impact on how things are going to evolve. So let's approach this very scientifically. So that's another thrust in these articles, is I mentioned this whole thing about letting participants really approach this field scientifically. So the first thing, or the first maxim, if you will, is learning to perceive light differently. And as I just suggested, light is in everything. It's going to drive the future of our world, besides the fact that we wouldn't exist without it. We're built from it. It's intimate within us. And so, therefore, at least theoretically, we should be able to access it quite easily, since it exists in every cell in our body, in every atom in our cell. It should be one of the easiest things to access. And the method for access I want to propose is simply re-seeing things in light. So we habitually, when we see things, we use our physical eyes, and our physical eyes, due to habit, have a particular way of perceiving. So I just want to propose that if we were to use a faculty that I'll call our mind's eye and see anything that's physical around us in such a way that we begin to perceive the light in it. So we may have to imagine that there's light in it, but my proposal is that the mere act of imagination will allow us to enter into relationship with this thing that is so real and so prevalent and so ubiquitous simply because it is ubiquitous. So actually imagining becomes a bridge whereby we connect to this layer of light much more fundamentally. So this first maxim is very simple. Just really learn to perceive light differently. The second maxim that I want to mention is this idea of fluency in light dynamics is a muscle that needs strengthening. So let me say a little bit more about this. When we meet circumstance, we have a particular way of meeting circumstance that we're habituated to. We have particular kinds of thoughts, particular perceptions, particular assumptions that arise for us individually, and we tend to process circumstance based on our own programming and just set of habits that become active automatically in a particular circumstance. When we do that, I want to propose that we have actually severed ourselves or cut ourselves off from reality because we're acting through this filter, and many times this filter will be inadequate, especially when a system is out of equilibrium or when a system is far from equilibrium. Light, I want to propose that since light intimately connects everything already, if we begin to just remember light, if we begin to imagine light, then already we're connecting with things in a fundamentally different way. And the more we practice kind of re-seeing things in light or processing circumstance with this view of light present in us, then the nature of how we can interact and see and react to things and imagine things or think of things is going to be different than in the absence of light. But like anything, it's going to require practice. I mean, we've got to exercise the sight from our mind's eye, and the more we do it, the more easy it becomes. So therefore, the second maxim is fluency in light dynamics is a muscle that needs strengthening. And in this article, I just go over some practical situations that are more relevant to the corporate space. But the point being is that being a Forbes article, it by necessity had to focus on there. But the application area can be much vaster. The third maxim is around creating a light sphere to help facilitate change. So one of the exercises that I make participants do, and that I even suggested in these Forbes articles, was, for example, if you are having some kind of slowdown or obstacle in a project you're working on, then to apply light to that situation or project, just imagine a sun, a imaginary sun filled with light, just shedding its light over this project. And just in your mind's eye, begin to see how this light interacts with the people and how it influences the project. And that's all you have to do, is just this imagination. And in creating a light sphere, the third maxim to help facilitate change, we push that initial exercise further. Again, so we're building a muscle, we're using more of this muscle in practical situations. But here, what I propose is that we see a sphere of light deep within ourselves, in our hearts, and then we get comfortable with the nature of light. We push our awareness into this small space in our hearts, and then we allow this light sphere to grow and grow and grow bigger until we're sitting in it, and then we invite a difficult situation or a difficult relationship or even something that might be bothering us into this light sphere, and have no judgment, because the point is that what I want to propose is that light has a different way of operating, and that's what I've written about extensively in the 10 books on the where I explore the mathematical power of light. Because in my perception, there's a persistent quantum level computation that's going on, and when we connect with light, we're in a sense getting closer to this computation without our filters. And when we have a certain intent, or when we think of a certain situation, we're connecting that situation with this fundamental layer of light, and therefore there's a different kind of information field that now surrounds that circumstance or project, that can be recomputed differently in this layer or this envisionment of light. And I just want to propose that that happens naturally and normally. Of course, it's out of our realm of thinking, and perhaps even out of the realm of our normal perception of what's real and what's not. But that's the point, is that we want to push ourselves to in a sense perceive what we've not perceived and think in a way we've not thought. And in doing so, we can open to, and the system can open to something different that already exists there, and we make it more alive through this kind of real-time processing. Now, I'm going to just pause there, and I'll say that I'll pick up the second article in this series tomorrow, and I'll also speak about how I use light as a pillar. So in partnership with Forbes, we offered an organizational sciences certification program that I created, and there were executives from about 150 companies who took part in that. And this was all recent. It was in the time frame of July, August, September this year. And a key pillar of the organizational sciences certification was light itself. So these 6 maxims of light were a key part of this certification program that many executives actually went through. And I'll speak about that a little more tomorrow.